He had ruled an empire without fear, yet in the final 90 seconds before his execution, the only name he whispered belonged to the woman everyone else had forgotten. A heavy silence settled over the federal correctional facility as the final countdown began. The digital clock mounted high above the observation room quietly displayed 1 minute and 30 seconds remaining before the sentence would be carried out. Uniformed officers moved with practiced precision. Legal representatives stood waiting behind reinforced glass, and every required document had already been signed. For everyone inside the building, the outcome seemed certain. Vincent Romano, once known throughout Chicago as one of the most influential mafia bosses in modern history, stood calmly inside the brightly lit chamber, wearing a simple white prison uniform instead of the tailored black suits that had once defined his presence. The confidence that had made powerful men hesitate was still visible in his posture, but something had changed inside his eyes. There was no anger, no panic, and no attempt to argue with fate. Only quiet acceptance mixed with the faint hope that one final promise had not been forgotten. The prison warden stepped forward carrying the official document containing the inmate's final request. Throughout his 30 years of service, he had witnessed countless last wishes. Some prisoners had asked to speak with family members. Others requested a favorite meal or a final prayer. Vincent Romano's request was unlike anything the warden had ever read. "Your final request has been approved," the warden said in a measured voice. "The person has been contacted." Vincent slowly lifted his eyes. "Is she coming?" The warden hesitated for only a moment before answering. "She is on her way." Several officials exchanged puzzled glances. One federal prosecutor quietly leaned toward another and whispered, "Who is she?" A corrections officer answered after reviewing the file. "A former housekeeper." The prosecutor frowned. "A housekeeper?" Another official corrected him. "According to the records, she worked in Mr. Romano's residence many years ago. Her name is Naomi Brooks." Confusion spread across the room. Reporters waiting outside the secured area had expected the notorious businessman to request a visit from an attorney, a political ally, or perhaps the surviving members of his family. Instead, the last person he wished to see was a Black Maid whose name had never appeared in newspapers or courtroom testimony. The question quietly passed from one observer to another. Why her? Vincent ignored every conversation around him. His attention remained fixed on the clock as the seconds disappeared one after another. Memories drifted silently across his mind, not of expensive penthouses, business negotiations, or public victories, but of ordinary mornings inside his old mansion. He remembered polished hardwood floors reflecting the sunrise, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the kitchen, and a woman who greeted every employee with the same quiet kindness regardless of their position. Naomi Brooks had never raised her voice. She had never asked for recognition. She simply carried herself with a dignity that could not be purchased, even by the wealthiest man in the city. There had been countless opportunities for her to walk away from hardship, yet she had remained loyal through seasons when loyalty had become almost impossible to find. A young corrections officer finally gathered enough courage to ask the question everyone else seemed unwilling to speak aloud. "Mr. Romano, why would someone like you ask to see a maid?" Vincent slowly turned toward him. A faint smile appeared for the first time that morning. "Because titles disappear," he answered softly. "Character does not." Those 7 words settled over the room with unexpected weight. Even the officers who had spent years guarding dangerous inmates found themselves unable to look away. Before anyone could ask another question, the secure entrance opened and the prison administrator hurried inside carrying a telephone. His normally composed expression had vanished. He approached the warden and quietly delivered a message that caused every person in the room to fall completely silent. The woman had accepted the request. She was already traveling under federal escort toward the prison. Vincent closed his eyes in quiet gratitude. For the first time in many years, hope entered the room before she did. More than 200 miles away from the federal prison, Naomi Brooks had already finished cleaning the wooden pews inside a small neighborhood church on the south side of Chicago. Morning sunlight filtered gently through stained glass windows, painting quiet colors across the polished floor as she carefully arranged fresh flowers near the altar. At 58 years old, the Black Maid carried herself with the same quiet grace that had once earned the respect of everyone who truly knew her. Her life had become wonderfully ordinary. She rented a modest apartment only a few blocks away, volunteered at the church several mornings each week, and accepted housekeeping jobs whenever families needed an extra pair of dependable hands. Most people who greeted her had no idea she had once worked inside one of the grandest estates in Illinois. Even fewer remembered the name Vincent Romano. To Naomi, those years belonged to another lifetime. She had packed away every memory except one. Hidden inside a small wooden box beneath her bed rested a sealed envelope, an old brass key, and a worn photograph she had never allowed herself to throw away. She had promised someone long ago that she would protect them until he personally asked for them again. For years, that promise had felt like carrying a conversation with silence itself. Just as she finished watering the flowers, her cellular telephone vibrated quietly inside her apron pocket. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar government number. She answered politely, expecting perhaps another housekeeping inquiry. Instead, a calm voice introduced himself as an official from the United States Department of Justice. Naomi listened without interrupting, but the color slowly disappeared from her face. The official explained that Vincent Romano had submitted one final request before his scheduled execution. He had asked to see only one person, her. Naomi lowered herself onto the nearest church pew as if her legs could no longer support her. For several long seconds, she was unable to speak. The years she had worked so carefully to place behind her suddenly returned with startling clarity. She remembered the enormous mansion overlooking Lake Michigan, the quiet mornings preparing breakfast before sunrise, the respectful way Vincent always thanked every employee by name, and the strange day he had entrusted her with a small locked box while telling her that one day he might come back for it. She had never opened it. Not once. "Miss Brooks," the official said gently after the silence stretched between them, "will you honor his request?" Naomi closed her eyes. She had prayed many times that Vincent would somehow find peace, but she had never imagined peace would arrive through a telephone call like this. "Yes," she answered softly. "I will come." Less than 45 minutes later, a black government vehicle stopped outside the church. Two federal agents greeted her with quiet professionalism, carrying none of the suspicion she had once grown accustomed to during the investigation years before. Naomi excused herself from the pastor, returned briefly to her apartment, and knelt beside her bed. She carefully removed the small wooden box that had remained untouched for 15 years. Dust covered its surface, but the lock remained exactly as Vincent had left it. She gently brushed it clean before placing it inside a cloth bag and holding it close against her chest. As the vehicle began the long drive toward the prison, endless fields and highways slipped past the windows, yet Naomi barely noticed the landscape. Her thoughts remained fixed on a single question that refused to leave her heart. After all these years, why had Vincent chosen this moment to ask for the one promise she had never broken? The federal vehicle continued north through miles of open highway while Naomi remained quietly seated in the back, her hands resting gently on the worn cloth bag that contained the locked wooden box. Neither of the federal agents attempted to interrupt her thoughts. They had been instructed only to ensure her safe arrival before the scheduled execution, but even they sensed there was far more to this journey than an ordinary final visit. As the miles passed beneath the tires, memories she had carefully buried for 15 years slowly resurfaced with remarkable clarity. She remembered the first morning she had walked through the gates of the Romano estate carrying nothing more than a small suitcase and a recommendation from a local church. The mansion had seemed impossibly grand, with marble floors stretching beneath towering ceilings and windows overlooking the calm waters of Lake Michigan. She had expected another wealthy employer who would barely notice the people working behind the scenes. Instead, Vincent Romano had surprised her from the very beginning. On her first day, he had looked directly at her, extended his hand, and said, "Welcome to our home, Miss Brooks. Thank you for being here." No one had ever introduced themselves to her that way before. In the years that followed, Naomi quietly became part of the rhythm of the household. She prepared breakfast before sunrise, organized guest rooms after charity events, and often remained long after everyone else had gone to bed, making certain every detail inside the mansion reflected peace instead of chaos. Although Vincent carried enormous responsibility outside those walls, inside the house he insisted that every employee be treated with dignity. Birthdays were remembered. Family emergencies were respected. Children of staff members received holiday gifts without their parents ever having to ask. It was not generosity performed for cameras. Almost no one outside the estate ever knew. Yet Naomi also noticed another side of the household. Certain business associates smiled in Vincent's presence, but whispered differently once he left the room. Trusted executives lingered behind closed doors, holding conversations that abruptly ended whenever she approached. Relatives who publicly praised Vincent privately questioned his decisions and spoke with an ambition that made Naomi deeply uncomfortable. She had never involved herself in matters beyond housekeeping, but years of quietly observing people had taught her something valuable. Floors were not the only things a maid learned to notice. She recognized dishonesty in hurried footsteps, forced laughter, and conversations that stopped too quickly. One rainy evening, while collecting empty coffee cups after a private meeting, Naomi accidentally overheard fragments of a discussion that left her heart unsettled. She never heard enough to understand the entire situation, only enough to realize that people Vincent trusted were hiding important truths from him. For 2 sleepless nights, she debated whether speaking would cross a boundary that was not hers to cross. Finally, she gathered the courage to request a private conversation. Vincent listened without interrupting, as Naomi carefully explained only what she had personally witnessed. She never exaggerated and never accused anyone directly. When she finished, Vincent thanked her for her honesty instead of dismissing her concerns. Before she returned to work, he quietly placed a small wooden box into her hands. "If anything ever happens to me," he had said with unusual seriousness, "promise me you will never open this. Keep it safe until I ask for it myself. No matter how many years pass." Naomi had looked into his eyes and answered without hesitation, "You have my word." That promise had remained unbroken every single day since then. As the prison walls finally appeared on the horizon beneath the afternoon sky, Naomi gently tightened her grip on the cloth bag. She still did not know why Vincent had waited until this very moment to call for her, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was inside the locked box had remained hidden for 15 years because one ordinary maid had believed that a promise was worth more than fear, convenience, or time itself. The steel gates closed quietly behind the government vehicle as Naomi stepped onto the prison grounds, carrying the same cloth bag that had never left her hands during the entire journey. The afternoon air felt strangely still, and even the officers escorting her lowered their voices as they guided her through a series of secured hallways. Every door opened with a mechanical buzz before locking again behind them, each sound reminding her that every step brought her closer to a meeting she had never imagined would happen. She had rehearsed countless questions during the drive, yet now none of them seemed important. What mattered was keeping the promise she had carried for 15 years. Inside a nearby conference room, prison officials, attorneys, and representatives from the Department of Justice quietly reviewed final procedures. The unusual request had attracted attention far beyond the prison walls. Several officials questioned why the meeting had been approved at all, while others insisted that honoring a lawful final request remained part of the system's responsibility. No one in the room understood why an elderly housekeeper had become the final visitor for one of the most recognizable men in Chicago's history. Only the prison warden noticed something unusual. Vincent had declined every previous opportunity to meet with attorneys, former business associates, and distant relatives. He had refused interviews, rejected public statements, and signed no personal letters. Naomi Brooks was the only name he had requested. After completing security procedures, Naomi was escorted into a small visitation room divided only by a simple table. There were no reporters, no cameras, and no audience. The officials observing through reinforced glass agreed that this conversation should remain private unless either visitor requested otherwise. Moments later, another door opened. Vincent Romano entered slowly, accompanied by 2 correctional officers who respectfully stepped back once he reached the table. For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. Time had changed both of them. Vincent's dark hair had turned almost completely gray, and years of confinement had softened the commanding presence that once filled boardrooms. Naomi's face carried gentle lines earned through honest work and quiet perseverance, yet the kindness in her eyes remained exactly as he remembered. Vincent smiled first. "Thank you for coming, Naomi." She returned the smile with visible emotion. I gave you my word. Vincent looked down at the cloth bag resting beside her chair. You still have it. Naomi carefully placed the worn wooden box onto the table. The brass lock had faded with age, but it remained unopened. Not once, she answered softly. Exactly as you asked. Vincent rested his hand gently on the box without opening it. His eyes remained fixed on the weathered wood, as though it contained far more than paper and metal. I knew you would keep your promise, he said quietly. Naomi hesitated before asking the question that had followed her throughout the entire drive. Why now, Vincent? Why wait all these years? He looked into her eyes with remarkable calm. Because until today, there was no one left I could completely trust. The room fell silent again. Naomi felt both relief and sorrow in those words. She had always believed loyalty mattered, but she had never realized how alone Vincent had become. He slowly pushed the wooden box back toward her instead of opening it himself. I need you to unlock it. Naomi looked surprised. You gave it to me, but you never gave me the key. Vincent nodded gently. The key is not inside the bag. Confused, she searched his face. Then where is it? A faint smile returned as he answered in almost a whisper. Exactly where you left it 15 years ago. Naomi suddenly froze. A forgotten memory surfaced with startling clarity, and for the first time since arriving at the prison, she realized this meeting was not about saying goodbye. It was about remembering something both of them had hidden from the rest of the world for far longer than either had ever expected. Naomi stared at Vincent in complete silence as the forgotten memory slowly returned. 15 years earlier, on a cold autumn evening, she had stood beside the fireplace in the Romano mansion while Vincent carefully locked the small wooden box before placing it in her hands. Just as he reached for the front door to leave for an important meeting, he paused, removed a tiny brass key from the ring in his pocket, and looked around the room. Instead of handing it to her, he walked to the old grandfather clock standing in the library, opened a narrow wooden panel near its base, and placed the key inside a hidden compartment before quietly closing it again. He smiled and said, If I ever need this box again, only someone who truly remembers that night will know where the key is waiting. Naomi had completely forgotten about the hiding place because she had never expected to use it. The memory faded as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the realization that the key had never been lost. It had simply been waiting. Vincent noticed the recognition in her eyes and nodded gently. You remember now. Naomi answered with a quiet smile. The grandfather clock in the library. Vincent leaned back in his chair with visible relief. Then the promise is still alive. She looked at the unopened box resting between them. What is inside that is worth waiting 15 years? Vincent remained silent for several moments before speaking. Not money, not jewels, not anything that can buy freedom. His voice became softer. The truth. Naomi searched his face, wondering why the truth would need to be hidden inside a locked box instead of spoken aloud. Vincent seemed to understand the question before she asked it. Sometimes the truth is only believed when the right people are finally willing to listen. Through the observation window, the prison warden watched the conversation with growing curiosity. He could not hear every word, but he noticed something remarkable. Neither visitor behaved as though they were saying farewell. There was sadness, certainly, but beneath it rested quiet confidence, as though both believed this meeting still had an unfinished purpose. Meanwhile, one of the Department of Justice attorneys reviewing Vincent's case received an unexpected telephone call from Chicago. A property manager responsible for maintaining the abandoned Romano estate reported that a court order authorizing final inventory had uncovered several untouched rooms that had remained sealed since Vincent's arrest. Among the listed items was an antique grandfather clock located in the mansion library. The attorney frowned as he listened. The timing felt strangely significant. Inside the visitation room, Vincent slowly placed both hands on the table. Naomi, I never asked whether you believed I was innocent. She answered without hesitation. Because I never stopped believing it. Vincent lowered his eyes, deeply moved by her simple reply. Even after everything people said? Naomi nodded. Character leaves a longer trail than rumors. I trusted the man I worked beside every day, not the headlines written afterward. Those words settled over Vincent more powerfully than any courtroom argument ever had. For 15 years he had lived knowing that almost everyone who once stood beside him had disappeared. Business partners had vanished. Friends had grown silent. Relatives had protected themselves. Yet the woman who had entered his home carrying nothing more than a suitcase had quietly protected both his promise and his reputation without asking for recognition. At that very moment, another prison official hurried into the observation room, carrying fresh paperwork. After speaking briefly with the warden, he glanced through the glass toward Vincent with obvious surprise. The maintenance report from Chicago had revealed something else. The hidden compartment inside the grandfather clock had never been inspected because investigators had never known it existed. The room fell silent once again as everyone slowly realized that whatever remained inside that forgotten clock might still be waiting exactly where Vincent had left it 15 years before. The prison warden immediately contacted the federal judge overseeing Vincent Romano's final proceedings, explaining that newly discovered information connected directly to the inmate's last request had surfaced only moments before the scheduled execution. No one claimed the discovery proved anything by itself, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Within minutes, a temporary administrative pause was authorized while investigators verified whether the hidden compartment inside the abandoned Romano estate actually existed. The decision surprised everyone involved. It was a rare moment when procedure made room for possibility. Inside the visitation room, Vincent noticed the activity beyond the glass, but remained calm. Naomi followed the movement of the officials with quiet curiosity before turning back toward him. "Did you know this would happen?" she asked softly. Vincent slowly shook his head. "I hoped they would finally be willing to look." Naomi lowered her eyes to the unopened wooden box resting between them. 15 years. Earlier she had believed she was simply protecting a personal belonging. Now she understood that she had been protecting something much larger than either of them had spoken aloud. A young attorney entered the observation room carrying a secure telephone connected directly to investigators who had already arrived at the Romano estate. Every person present listened carefully as the property manager guided them through the silent mansion. Dust covered nearly every surface. Sunlight filtered through windows that had not been opened for years, and the once magnificent home now echoed with nothing but footsteps. Following the maintenance report, the investigators entered the old library where the towering grandfather clock still stood exactly where Naomi remembered seeing it for the last time. One investigator carefully examined the lower wooden panel before pressing gently against the decorative trim. A soft click echoed through the room. The hidden compartment slowly opened. For several seconds no one spoke. Resting inside was a tiny brass key, untouched by time, exactly where Vincent had hidden it 15 years before. The investigator carefully removed it while another photographed the compartment for official records. The attorney inside the prison quietly lowered the telephone and looked toward the judge's representative. "The compartment is real," he said, "and the key has been recovered." Even the prison warden seemed unable to hide his surprise. Everything Naomi had remembered was true. Nothing had been invented. Vincent closed his eyes briefly, not in celebration but in gratitude. At last, someone besides Naomi had witnessed the first piece of the truth. Moments later, the attorney entered the visitation room, carrying the remarkable news. Naomi listened silently before looking down at the small wooden box. For the first time in 15 years, the key and the lock would soon be reunited. "The investigators are bringing it here under federal custody," the attorney explained. "No one will open the box until every required official is present." Vincent nodded in complete agreement. That is exactly how it should be. Naomi studied his peaceful expression. "You trusted that I would protect it all this time." Vincent smiled gently. "I trusted that you would protect your promise. The box simply came with it." His answer filled the quiet room with a warmth that none of the observers expected to feel inside a federal prison. The officials no longer saw only a former mafia boss and a retired housekeeper. They saw two people connected by a promise that had survived 15 years of silence, public judgment, and forgotten history. As the recovered brass key began its journey back toward the prison under official escort, another question quietly settled over everyone waiting inside. If the very first secret had proven to be exactly where Vincent said it would be, what truth had remained sealed inside the wooden box all these years, patiently waiting for the right moment to be revealed? Nearly 3 hours later, a federal evidence vehicle entered the prison through a secured service gate under escort. Every step of the transfer followed strict legal procedure. The recovered brass key was sealed inside a transparent evidence container, accompanied by official photographs, signed reports, and verification from the investigators who had discovered it inside the hidden compartment of the grandfather clock. No one had expected such a discovery to emerge from a final request, and yet the chain of evidence was undeniable. Inside the visitation room, Naomi remained seated across from Vincent, the wooden box still resting untouched between them. Neither of them spoke very much during the long wait. They no longer needed words to explain why they had come this far. Their shared silence carried more trust than most conversations ever could. When the prison warden entered carrying the evidence case, every person observing through the reinforced glass instinctively stood. The brass key was carefully removed and placed beside the weathered lock on the wooden box. The warden looked toward Vincent before asking the required question. "Do you wish to proceed?" Vincent slowly nodded. "Yes, but Miss Brooks will unlock it." Naomi looked surprised. "It belongs to you." Vincent answered with the same calm certainty he had shown throughout the day. "No, it belongs to the promise you kept." Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the tiny brass key. 15 years had passed since she had last seen it, yet it slipped into the lock as smoothly as though no time had passed at all. A quiet click echoed through the room. No one moved. Naomi slowly lifted the lid. Inside were no stacks of money, no expensive jewelry, and no secret account numbers. Instead, the box contained a neatly organized collection of ordinary items. There was a leather journal, several handwritten letters tied together with a simple blue ribbon, a small digital voice recorder, and a sealed envelope bearing only one handwritten sentence. In clear black ink, Vincent had written, "To whoever still believes that truth deserves another chance." The prison warden carefully examined the contents without disturbing their order before handing the envelope to the federal judge's representative, who had arrived during the delay. Following legal protocol, the envelope was opened in the presence of every official. The first page contained a signed statement written by Vincent himself 15 years earlier. Rather than defending his reputation, the document explained why he had chosen to preserve evidence instead of revealing it immediately. He wrote that exposing the truth too early would place innocent people under unbearable public pressure before they could safely testify. He believed that one day the complete story would matter more than his own freedom. The officials continued reading in complete silence. The letters inside the blue ribbon had been written by former employees, accountants, and business advisors who had privately documented conversations, financial records, and decisions that painted a very different picture of the events leading to Vincent's conviction. Each document had been dated, notarized, and carefully preserved. Finally, the judge's representative picked up the digital voice recorder. After confirming that the chain of custody remained intact, he pressed the play button. A calm male voice filled the quiet room. It belonged to a respected attorney who had passed away years earlier. Speaking clearly, he explained that he had voluntarily recorded his statement to be released only if the evidence inside the wooden box was ever opened. He described hidden records, confidential meetings, and overlooked documents that he believed would eventually confirm facts never fully examined during the original investigation. When the recording ended, no one inside the room spoke for several long moments. The prison warden slowly removed his glasses, while the federal attorneys exchanged stunned expressions. What had begun as a simple final request had become something entirely different. It was no longer about honoring the last wish of a condemned man. It had become the beginning of a search for the complete truth, and for the first time in 15 years, everyone in the room realized that Naomi Brooks had not simply protected a wooden box. She had quietly protected the possibility that justice had never reached its final destination. The atmosphere inside the prison changed almost instantly. What had begun as a routine legal procedure now carried the unmistakable weight of unfinished history. The federal judge's representative requested an immediate review of every document recovered from the wooden box, while attorneys carefully compared the handwritten statements with records preserved in the original case files. Every signature matched. Every date aligned. Every page pointed toward questions that had never been fully explored. No one rushed to conclusions, but no one dismissed the evidence either. Vincent remained seated across from Naomi with the same quiet composure he had shown throughout the day. He had waited 15 years for this moment, yet he did not celebrate. His greatest hope had never been to prove himself right. It had always been that the complete truth would finally be given the chance to speak for itself. Naomi looked at him with gentle concern. "You knew they would need time," she said softly. Vincent nodded. "Truth moves more slowly than rumors, but it usually arrives with stronger footsteps." Those simple words lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. Outside the visitation room, senior officials contacted the federal court requesting an emergency judicial review. Because newly authenticated evidence had surfaced immediately before the sentence was scheduled to be carried out, the court authorized an indefinite stay while an independent panel examined every document connected to the case. The announcement spread quietly through the facility. Officers who had prepared for a very different afternoon now found themselves witnessing something few had ever experienced during their careers. Hours later, the first preliminary findings began arriving from forensic specialists. The ink, paper, electronic files, and recorded testimony all appeared authentic. Nothing suggested recent fabrication or manipulation. More importantly, several financial records referenced in the letters matched archived banking documents that investigators had overlooked years earlier. The evidence did not instantly rewrite history, but it clearly justified reopening the investigation. The prison warden entered the room carrying the official notice. His expression reflected both professionalism and genuine respect. "Mr. Romano," he said calmly, "the court has ordered a full review. Your sentence has been suspended pending further proceedings." Vincent closed his eyes for a brief moment before quietly whispering, "Thank you." Naomi smiled through tears of relief, not because every question had already been answered, but because hope had finally been given a legal place to stand. The warden then turned toward her. "Miss Brooks, I have worked in corrections for more than 3 decades. I have seen people protect fortunes, reputations, and personal interests. I have never seen anyone protect a promise for 15 years without asking for recognition." Naomi lowered her eyes modestly. A promise does not become less important simply because other people forget it. Her answer silenced the room once again. One of the younger federal attorneys quietly admitted that before meeting Naomi, he had assumed she was only a former employee mentioned in an old personnel file. Now he understood that history often remembered famous names while overlooking ordinary people whose integrity quietly shaped the outcome of extraordinary events. As evening sunlight filtered through the narrow prison windows, Vincent looked across the table at Naomi with sincere gratitude. "Whatever happens next," he said gently, "I never wanted my last memory to be a courtroom. I wanted it to be the face of the one person who reminded me that dignity cannot be taken away unless we surrender it ourselves." Naomi reached across the table and placed her hand gently over the weathered wooden box. "Then let this be the beginning instead of the ending." For the first time in many years, everyone inside that prison believed those words might actually come true. The weeks that followed transformed what many people had assumed was a finished chapter into the beginning of a remarkable search for truth. Independent investigators, forensic accountants, and legal experts carefully examined every document recovered from the wooden box alongside records that had remained untouched for years. One overlooked detail led to another until a complete timeline finally emerged. Conversations once dismissed as insignificant suddenly fit together with financial records, sworn statements, and archived correspondence that had quietly waited for someone willing to examine them without prejudice. Months later, the federal court concluded that Vincent Romano's conviction could no longer stand as originally entered because critical evidence had never been fully considered. The ruling did not erase the years he had lost, but it restored something even more valuable. It restored his good name. On the morning Vincent walked out of the federal correctional facility, there were no grand celebrations waiting beyond the gates. No luxury cars lined the entrance. No former business partners rushed forward with apologies. Many of the people who had once surrounded power had disappeared long before the truth returned. Only one familiar face stood quietly beneath the bright Chicago sky. Naomi Brooks waited patiently beside a simple bench holding the same cloth bag that had carried the wooden box on the day everything changed. When Vincent stepped through the gate, neither of them hurried toward the other. They simply smiled with the quiet understanding shared by two people who had kept faith through years of silence. "You waited," Vincent said gently. Naomi nodded. "I told you that I would." For a long moment, they stood together without speaking. Sometimes gratitude was too deep for ordinary words. A few days later, Vincent asked Naomi to accompany him on one final visit before either of them returned to ordinary life. Together, they drove to the abandoned Romano estate overlooking Lake Michigan. Dust still covered the marble floors, and sunlight poured through windows that had remained closed for years. They walked slowly into the old library where the towering grandfather clock still stood in its familiar place. Vincent rested his hand against the polished wood and smiled. "This clock protected more than a key," he said quietly. Naomi looked around the peaceful room. "It protected hope." Vincent nodded. "No, you protected hope." Those words touched Naomi more deeply than any public recognition ever could. She had never wanted credit for what she had done. She had only wanted to honor a promise. Before leaving the estate, Vincent handed the wooden box back to her. Naomi looked surprised. "It belongs to you now," she said. Vincent gently shook his head. "The evidence belonged to the court. The promise belonged to us. Keep the box as a reminder that ordinary people can preserve extraordinary truth." Naomi accepted it with quiet gratitude. In the months that followed, Vincent sold the estate and used much of its value to establish scholarships for students pursuing careers in public service, ethics, and law. He insisted that the program bear Naomi Brooks's name instead of his own because he believed future generations deserved to remember that integrity often worked quietly behind the scenes. Naomi continued living in the same modest neighborhood and volunteering at the same church. Her daily routine changed very little, but countless people who learned her story began greeting her with a new kind of respect. She accepted every kind word with the same humility she had always carried. Years later, visitors often asked Vincent what had truly saved him. Some expected him to mention brilliant attorneys or newly discovered evidence. He always answered the same way. "Evidence opened the door," he would say with a peaceful smile. But one faithful woman kept that door from disappearing. And on that quiet day, everyone who witnessed their journey remembered that dignity is never measured by wealth, titles, or power. It is measured by the promises we keep when no one is watching.